Hello, everyone. My name is Pradeep Nayak. I'm at the University of Waterloo and also part of the Vulnerability to Viability Global Partnership for Building Strong Small-Scale Fisheries. Today, I will be hosting and facilitating this webinar. Um, I would start that by making a few rounds of introductions. First introducing the V2B Global Partnership. Then I will introduce the thematic webinar series, after which I will introduce our speaker today, and then we will listen to the talk that is planned for today's thematic webinar series. So just as a way of introduction, the Vulnerability to Viability Global Partnership is a transdisciplinary research, knowledge, and action network with over 100 members from Africa, Asia, Canada, and internationally. The goal of this global partnership is to support small-scale fisheries in the communities that work within this sector in their transition from vulnerability to viability. And the way we focus and work on vulnerability and viability is not just to include the economic dimensions of these concepts and terms, but also to focus on all aspects of human life that encompasses the political, the cultural, ecological, environmental, cultural aspects of small-scale fisheries. So it's more comprehensive understanding of vulnerability and viability rather than just an economic understanding. Our focus within this partnership project is manifold. So we try to co-create and co-produce knowledge that is effective and important for the transition from vulnerability to viability. We are also trying to capture and process the co-produced knowledge within repositories or databases, creating information system. We are developing multifaceted capacity, right from the community level to the researchers and universities and other stakeholders. We have also engaged and are engaging in synthesizing and integrating the knowledge so that it can be available and used for governance and policy focused on small-scale fisheries. And of course, knowledge mobilization to that effect is an important part of our work. The B2B Global Partnership aims to identify the diverse factors and conditions contributing to the vulnerabilities of small-scale fisheries, and also aim to engage collaboratively with small-scale fisher communities and other key stakeholders, including the civil society, NGO, government, and university partners to enhance SSF or small-scale fisheries viability. We're conducting transdisciplinary, community-engaged, policy-driven research in 6 countries in Asia, which includes Bangladesh, India, Indonesia, Japan, Malaysia, and Thailand, and 6 countries in Africa that includes Ghana, Malawi, Nigeria, Senegal, South Africa, and Tanzania. But beyond this, we have partners in other continents and countries. In doing this kind of work, the B2B Global Partnership brings people and organizations together across physical, cultural, and disciplinary boundaries through a shared interest in addressing global change impacts on small-scale fisheries. The B2B thematic webinar series, for which we have virtually gathered here today, is an initiative of the B2B Global Partnership to facilitate and generate high-level discussions on vulnerability and viability themes and topics within the scope of small-scale fisheries. The goal is to feature academics, government representatives, practitioners, and members of the civil society who have made significant contributions to the theoretical, practical, and policy aspects of small-scale fisheries, both locally and also globally. And we'll have a glimpse of that today, through today's talk. B2B thematic webinar series takes place on the last Friday of every month, today being 1, and it will continue to be so during the whole year of 2025. The series is available internationally through live streaming on YouTube. Details regarding the monthly webinars and the speakers, topics, timings, and other details can be found at www.b2bglobalpartnership.org. Today's webinar is the is the 8th in the series of V2B thematic webinar series planned for the year 2025, and 56th since January 2021 when we started this series. And it is my privilege today to introduce Dr. Julia Nakamura as our distinguished speaker for the thematic webinar series. Dr. Julia Nakamura is a legal officer with the Development Law Service, LEGN, of the Legal Office of the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, at the United Nations. She supports the work of LEGN in delivering technical assistance and advice on areas of food and agriculture law. In this role, Dr. Nakamura contributes to various publications and activities relating to the small-scale fisheries guidelines implementation through policy and legal frameworks and necessary advice. Dr. Julia Nakamura has completed her PhD on international law for small-scale fisheries, specifically the application of ecosystem and human rights approaches for securing participatory international fisheries management and conservation in the UK. A major thrust of Dr. Nakamura's research is about clarifying the contributions of international law for securing sustainable small-scale fisheries. And law has been often not so much discussed area within the small-scale fisheries discussion. So Dr. Nakamura's work fills this critical gap in terms of bringing the legal and law and the policy aspects at an international level into the discussion of small-scale fisheries. She has been collaborating with many organizations and networks, including the Too Big to Ignore, which is a partner of B2B for small-scale fisheries research, and she's a member there. She has been contributing to the projects of unlocking legal and policy frameworks for small-scale fisheries and the online events such as Small is Bountiful. Dr. Nakamura's area of work includes skills and expertise and interests, including law and legal studies. And these are critical areas I emphasize because not a lot of people work on these areas within small-scale fisheries. So it includes law and legal studies, legal analysis, legal research, international law, international human rights law, international environmental law, environmental justice, law and sea, fisheries and fisheries law. These are really important areas, as I would like to emphasize. Over 2 dozens of publications in these areas. Dr. Nakamura's thesis was recently published by Routledge under the title International Law for Small-Scale Fisheries, Connecting the Ecosystem Approach and Human Rights to Secure Participatory Fisheries Management in 2025. And it provides an original and groundbreaking account of the applicability of and key contributions of international law to small-scale fisheries, and a fisheries subsector that has been historically overlooked by governments and international legal scholarship. So I invite you to kind of take a look at this, key literature that has been created in 2025 through her book. Dr. Nakamura has been deeply interested in the work of B2B Global Partnership and continues to be a close collaborator with several of our members and institutions, and we are very proud of that. It is my honor to invite Dr. Julia Nakamura to deliver today's talk for the V2B thematic webinar series, August 2025. And the title of her talk is going to be Transforming International Governance Through the Small-Scale Fisheries Guideline. Thank you very much, Julia, for making time and giving this talk. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Pradeep, for the very kind introduction, and thank you so much again for the invitation. Congratulations to the V2V for the great work done so far and all the initiatives. It's really a great honor to be here. Thank you for those who are joining online for your interest. I will start sharing my screen. So as Pradeep mentioned, my talk will be about transformation of international fisheries governance through the small-scale fisheries guidelines. So I believe most of you are familiar with this document, but I just wanted to highlight it from the onset, how it looks. And this is the document, the voluntary guidelines for securing sustainable small-scale fisheries in the context of food security and poverty eradication. and we call it, for its short title, Small-Scale Fisheries Guidelines. It's a document that was adopted by states. They agreed by consensus, which means there's no opposition against its adoption, under the auspices of FAO. And it is the main international law instrument dedicated to small-scale fisheries. Now, before I go into the small-scale fisheries guidelines, I wanted to go through a little bit about fisheries governance from a global perspective, specifically from an FAO perspective. So we cannot think about international fisheries governance without thinking about the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think many may not be familiar with the fact that FAO actually is a custodian of 21 SDGs indicators. And these span across different SDGs. They're not only about SDG 14, which we usually associate because it relates to fisheries, sustainable fisheries, but also goes into all these other SDGs that are highlighted here in the slide. And importantly, when it comes to small-scale fisheries, there is an explicit reference to small-scale fishers in SDG 2.3, which calls for doubling agricultural productivity and incomes of small-scale food producers, in particular, women, indigenous peoples, family farmers, pastoralists, and fishers. And of course, as we know, SDG 14b, which calls for providing access for small-scale artisanal fishers to marine resources and markets. So, but of course, we know that the issues involving small-scale fisheries, the challenges are much broader than only fisheries management and production of fisheries resources. It speaks a lot to the social development, access to tenure rights, and so on. And this, therefore, it's important to look into all SDGs holistically. So in this regard, and now moving into governance per se, so fisheries governance is embedded in three main elements, which are the institutions, the policy, and the legal framework. Now, when we are talking about FAO, there are many bodies that are part of this institutional framework. And I think it's important to clarify what those institutions are and the different instruments that are also part of this governance framework. And this is to illustrate the complexity of fisheries governance and how, therefore, it's so important to ensure good coordination, cooperation, exchange of information, making sure that efforts are conducted in a coherent way through cooperation. So I'm gonna go through each of these elements. So starting with institutions, of course, in addition to FAO as an organization, FAO has its governing bodies. And this diagram shows what are considered the governing bodies within FAO. So we have the conference, which is the supreme governing body that takes decisions related to policy and budget. You have the council, which advises the conference, but it's also an executive arm of the conference, so can take decisions relating to food and agriculture when in times where there's a need and one cannot wait for the conference meeting to occur. You also have the regional conferences. Here on the left, you see you have dedicated regional conferences for Africa, Asian Pacific, Europe, Latin American and Caribbean, and Near East. And these also produces decisions that are informing the council and the conference. You have the council committees here in the middle, the program committee, finance committee, and the committee on constitution and legal matters. And the technical committees, which I will, of course, be highlighting the Committee on Fisheries, which is the main international body that is producing a forum for states to discuss producing, it's offering, it is a forum for states to discuss issues relating to fisheries and aquaculture. And therefore promoting the exchange of information and ensuring that states take decisions that are coherent and that correspond to the current needs of the sector. So the Committee on Fisheries, within the Committee on Fisheries, which meets every 2 years, you have important decisions that states make and they adopt, for instance, declarations such as the 2021 COFI Declaration for Sustainable Fisheries and Aquaculture, which provides recommendations for states and therefore is an important guiding instrument as well. You have the report on the world fisheries, the state of the world fisheries and aquaculture, which contains updated information on the status of the resources, which is also very important to inform decisions relating to management of fisheries and aquaculture. You have also, for instance, the Blue Transformation Roadmap, which is guiding also the work of FAO in those areas, setting out priorities and action to be taken. And then you have also the subcommittees. So you have 3 subcommittees, and these 3 subcommittees each have its own mandates. They have its own rules of procedure, and they also meet on a regular basis. One is dedicated to fish trade. So it's discussing technical and economic aspects of international trade in fisheries and aquaculture. You have the subcommittee on aquaculture, which is also, again, another forum for consultation, discussion, and recommendations specifically in the field of aquaculture. And you have the most recently established subcommittee on fisheries management, which is also, again, another forum for discussion by governments on more technical level relating to technical policy guidance on fisheries governance and management. In addition to these bodies, you also have regional fishery bodies, which have been established according to the FAO Constitution. Now, regional fishery bodies, in the context of FAO, there are 2 types, main types. Those that are constituted under Article 6 of the FAO Constitution. So this means that they have not been established by a legally binding instrument. So these are the ones in yellow. You have the one dedicated to the Eastern Central Atlantic, another on Indian Ocean, Western Central Atlantic Fishery Commission, the one on inland fisheries and aquaculture of Africa, another in Europe, and the one in Latin America for small-scale artisanal fisheries and aquaculture. And you also have the other type, which is those regional fishery bodies established according to Article 14 of the FAO Constitution. Now, these bodies were established by a legally binding instrument. So the members of the Commission have ratified the agreement that had established those commissions. And these are the ones here in blue. Now, the ones that have this dotted square are circumvented by the dotted square. These are considered regional fisheries management organizations, RFMOs. In international fisheries law scholarship, and also according to a paper that was produced by FAO, the regional fishery bodies can be advisory, but they can be managerial, have a management mandate, which means that they can adopt legally binding conservation management measures. So these are known as RFMOs. And those regional fishery bodies established pursuant to Article 14 of the FAO constitutions that have the mandate to adopt legally binding conservation management measures are those here that you can see, the CACFISH, GFCM, COFI, and IOTC. Now, as I mentioned, fisheries governance is about institutions. It's about also the instruments that can be legally binding and non-binding. So in the context of FAO, you have, we can kind of divide those instruments into main three categories. So you have those that are speaking more to the institution, so institutional instruments, so the constitution that has established the organization. You have general rules of the organization, which specifies further details on the functions and other rules of the organization. Then you have rules of procedures for each of the committees and the commissions that I mentioned before. And for the subcommittees, you have the terms of reference. And then also you have some statutes in certain cases of commissions. So these are kind of the rules, the what is regulating those institutions and their functions, their mandates, and so on. Now you also have the middle column is the convention and agreements. So these are instruments legally binding. And for instance, you see here again the same references to the regional fisheries management organizations that I mentioned in the previous slide, because those were established by legally binding instruments according to Article 14 of the FAO Constitution. But you also have, in the context of fisheries, these two key instruments, which is the agreement to promote compliance with international conservation management measures by fishing vessels on the high seas, the compliance agreement, and the agreement on port states measures to prevent, deter, and eliminate illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, PSMA. And these are two key instruments which FAO serves as the secretariat. You also have non-binding instruments, and this is the majority, most of the instruments, and there are this sheer number of instruments that are non-binding that have been adopted under the auspices of FAO. And here are some examples which speak to fisheries more specifically, and which are also important to small-scale fisheries. And I will be, of course, focusing on the small-scale fisheries guidelines later on. But yeah, and just to complete, another type of FAO guidance is also in the form of the technical guidelines for responsible fisheries, which also has many of them. And they are elaborating on specific topics that are covered by the Code of Conduct for Responsible Fisheries. They are detailing what those recommendations mean and providing further recommendations in more technical in detail. You also have the action plans, the international plans of action relating to IU fishing, fishing capacity, management and conservation of sharks. You have also legal guides and tools, and these, the ones that the FAO legal office, in specifically the Development Law Service where I work, is contributing in the development of these legal guides and tools. Now, the importance of small-scale fisheries in international law and governance. I hear that this slide has a lot of information, but I think my intention was to kind of show a timeline and the evolution, right? And how this has been significantly transformed through the small-scale fisheries guidelines. As you can see from one side, on the left, the framework was primarily focusing on fisheries management, conservation to some extent, and there had been no, or perhaps very, very little attention given to social aspects and human rights, equity, the protection of fishers, and so on. But I mean, there are some references. I'll be detailing those in the next slide, but the point is that in 2003, through the UNGA resolution on sustainable fisheries, there has been more attention given to small-scale fisheries and calling for attention, and up to the point of having mandated FAO to lead the development of the small-scale fisheries guidelines, which were adopted in 2014. And from there, that time, since the adoption of the guidelines, there has been a lot of other instruments at different governance levels at the international level. So here you have, well, at the regional level, let's start with the regional level. You have here the model law on small-scale fisheries by the Latin America and Caribbean Parliament. You have the General Fisheries Commission for the Mediterranean, GFCM, the Regional Plan of Action for Small-Scale Fisheries, the Caribbean Regional Fisheries Mechanism Protocol on small-scale fisheries. At the national level, countries have adopted national plans of actions to implement the small-scale fisheries guidelines. So you have here examples of Tanzania, Namibia, Malawi, Philippines, Madagascar, and of course, the International Year of Artisanal Fisheries and Aquaculture in 2022 really boosted the momentum for this fishery subsector. There were a lot of events and a lot of initiatives promoting the contribution of small-scale fisheries to sustainable development, really twisting a bit of the discourse to a more positive lens and showcasing really the contributions of small-scale fisheries to sustainable development. And the small scale fisheries guidelines has really been like a really key moment for small scale fisheries in this regard, because it's embedded on a human rights based approach. So really shedding light to the right holders as opposed to the duty bearers, looking into the rights of small scale fishers and the need to include them in meaningfully include them in fisheries management and conservation, noting not only their contributions to it through their knowledge, through their experiences, and but also the impacts that the conservation and management can have on them, unfair competition with other sectors, and so on. Another important element of the guidelines is the ecosystem approach to fisheries, which is a holistic approach to way to manage fisheries in a more decentralized manner. So really promoting participatory management and equity development. So also take into account that small-scale fishers, they have special needs, and also there are women, indigenous peoples, migrants, and other more considered in a vulnerable conditions that need special attention. So therefore, you need to take some actions in order to facilitate their inclusion and make them achieve an equal standard with others. As I was mentioning, why that framework was not sufficient, right? If you look into the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, there are very few provisions that are relevant to small-scale fisheries. So those provisions that are relevant, they refer to fishing communities, and they are primarily requiring states, in this case, coastal states, to take into account the interests of fishing communities or the impacts of on fishing communities when establishing conservation management measures in exclusive economic zones. So when a coastal state is establishing those measures, they have to take into account the needs and the interests of fishing communities. But this also does not, it is quite vague, the provision. And the same for those landlocked states and geographically disadvantaged states. The requirements also to take into account impacts on fishing communities when entering fishing access agreements to fish on other coastal states' waters. The same for, I mean, there has been some progress with the UN Fish Stocks Agreement, which is the agreement that is elaborating the provisions of the Law of the Sea Convention with respect to conservation and management measures of straddling fish stocks and highly migratory fish stocks. in the sense that there was an explicit principle in that agreement to referring to artisanal and subsistence fishers within the principles in the duty to cooperate for establishing those conservation and management measures, as well as in the provision relating to special requirements of developing states, ensuring access by small-scale fisheries, especially in small island developing states. Now, this is again very specific in the context of conservation management measures of those straddling fish stocks and highly migratory fish stocks. And then the Code of Conduct for Responsible Fisheries, which is a non-binding instrument, although there are many provisions that already reflect what is in the other legally binding instruments, such as the UNCLOS and the compliance agreement. The Code of Conduct for Responsible Fisheries has more provisions relevant to small-scale fisheries, such as in relation to the protection of rights of fishers and fish workers, the need to grant preferential access to fishing grounds to small-scale fishers, interest of fishers when adopting, again, conservation management measures, reference to reserved zones to artisanal fishers, and the also attention given to indigenous peoples and the recognition of traditional knowledge in the context of fisheries management. But, again, these instruments were quite specific in what they covered and not sufficient in looking into all the relevant issues for small-scale fisheries. And this is why, again, the small-scale fisheries guidelines, it's really a landmark in providing a very comprehensive and broad framework that covers various issues and also contemporary matters, I guess, one could say, in relation to gender equity and equality and climate change, disaster risks, and so on. But really, the entire instrument dedicated to small-scale fisheries brings this subsector to a much more heightened importance. Another important instrument not to forget is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Peasants and Other People Working in Rural Areas, which is known also as UNDROP. And this is a human rights instrument, but which has in its Article 1 reference, the applicability of that instrument being to small-scale fishers as well. So one should read those instruments all in conjunction to have a more comprehensive framework for small-scale fisheries. Now, zooming into the guidelines and its importance in this international fisheries governance framework, it is a voluntary instrument, and we all know what that means in the sense that it's non-binding, so states do not have the obligation to implement the guidelines. However, and I argue this in an article, the importance of the guidelines being while being voluntary still can hold normative significance. And the main three reasons for that is if looking into the legitimate process of making and adopting those guidelines, the normative content that it contains, and the lawmaking effects that it has produced and continues to produce at various levels of governance. So the legitimate process of international lawmaking, the UNGA resolution has established the mandate of FAO to develop those guidelines. And so FAO has led the process, which entailed regional consultations and participation of all relevant stakeholders engaged in small-scale fisheries. So to ensure participation, meaningful participation, and diverse contributions from different knowledge and backgrounds of experiences and so on. And also this ensured that the process was gained more legitimacy and authority in that sense through deliberation and transparency. And as I mentioned, the guidelines were adopted by consensus, so there was no formal opposition and that ensures that the guidelines have been therefore agreed at the global level and would foster consistency in subsequent state practice. Now, what do we mean by normative content? It's a guiding text. It has a language that is recommending, in the sense it's more kind of or recognizing, encouraging, recommending, and so the language itself really speaks to a voluntary instrument. But this does not necessarily mean that this cannot contain some normative significance, in the sense that there are many references in the guidelines to existing legally binding instruments. So there is explicit reference to the Law of the Sea Convention in building on the Law of the Sea Convention regime, the International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the Convention against all forms of elimination, the Convention on the Elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, Convention on the Rights of the Child, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and conventions that were adopted by the International Labour Organization. So in that, those are legally binding instruments which states have ratified. I mean, many states. These are these instruments. They have a global scope. So what the SSF guidelines do is really linking those obligations to the small-scale fisheries context. Those treaties will not refer explicitly to small-scale fisheries, but they should be observed, and those matters relating to the protection of women, to the protection of the child, to climate change, to labor, decent work, they should all be observed in the small-scale fisheries context. So this is why it's so important also to sort of reinforce the obligation of states to, for instance, modifying the small-scale fisheries context, social and cultural patterns of conduct, for eliminating prejudices and practices based on the idea of inferiority or superiority of either sexes. This is a specific provision of the CEDAW, and therefore contributes to securing equal and fair participation of women in decision-making processes for small-scale fisheries-related policies. So what the SSF guidelines speak to that particular provision and sort of contextualizes into the small-scale fisheries context. Now, there are certain states that are not parties to those treaties that I mentioned in the previous slide. So in that sense, the SSF guidelines can even play an even greater role, in the sense that where states are not parties to a treaty, they can refer, their standard setting or their guidance reference would be a non-binding instrument. And in this sense, those states, as part of FAO, as part of a global, in the global context of through the Committee on Fisheries, have endorsed the small-scale fisheries guidelines. So their reference and should be therefore the SSF guidelines. And in this sense, and here I'm just referring to those states that are not parties to a specific treaty that the SSF guidelines mention, would then could use the SSF guidelines as a reference to follow specific recommendations that are relevant to small-scale fisheries. And finally, there are the lawmaking effects at national level. And I have been working with colleagues in different colleagues in the Fisheries and Aquaculture Division, and also in the legal office, in developing the small-scale fisheries lex, which you can see on the right here, bottom. This is a website. It's a legal and policy database on small-scale fisheries that you can have access to. It's fairly easy to find if you Google SSF Lex. And these instruments here that you can see from different countries, they are they are presented in the homepage of the SSF Lex as examples of instruments that are implementing or supporting the implementation of the small-scale fisheries guidelines, because they refer to the small-scale fisheries guidelines, and this is why also an important evidence that the small-scale fisheries guidelines are influencing policy and legal instruments at the national level, and having that effect and having that influence in this respect. So just to mention that, and there are some examples. There may be more, but here are just some examples. And then also taking this opportunity to also showcase the work that we have been doing with in promoting the implementation of the small-scale fisheries guidelines in FAO from a policy and legal perspective. So where states wish to develop a new law that is specifically dedicated to small-scale fisheries, a small-scale fisheries specific law, then we have a guide, a legislative guide that provides considerations for legal drafting in that respect. So some key considerations when it comes to legislating for small-scale fisheries. Now, if one would like to look into a policy legal framework, a fisheries legislation to understand the extent to which it is aligned with the small-scale fisheries guidelines, or if it addresses sufficiently the key issues for small-scale fisheries, then we have this other policy and legal diagnostic tool, which provides this assessment, which allows users to conduct their assessments to understand better what the policy and legislation provides when it comes to small-scale fisheries issues. And then one could identify potential strengths, gaps in that framework, and needs for improvement. And then we have also developed a policy brief on the sort of unpacking what the human rights-based approach means, and how to achieve multiple sustainable development goals. And that speaks to the very first slide I presented when I'm really highlighting the importance of looking to SDGs broadly, as they speak to different matters that are important for small-scale fisheries. And the human rights-based approach is really calling for the need to apply those principles, principles that are human rights-based principles that are sort of based on the international human rights framework, and which are in the SSF guidelines, such as respect of culture, non-discrimination, gender equity and equality, equity and equality, more generally speaking, consultation, participation, transparency, accountability, and so on. So those principles should be observed when in small-scale fisheries, when engaging with small-scale fisheries in decision-making processes, ensuring that they are participating in a meaningful way, they are consulted, that the information that is being provided to them is easily accessible, and that, of course, taking into account that they are living in vulnerable conditions. So it is important to make sure that it is an inclusive process. And then we also developed an e-learning course, and you can find this picture here on the right, that is about the legal and policy considerations for sustainable small-scale fisheries. This e-learning course also builds on those documents that we have produced, and it really helps one to also understand better what are the considerations to take into account when developing or reviewing legal and policy instruments for sustainable small-scale fisheries. Again, the importance of not looking into the fisheries specific instruments, but also the Constitution, those instruments related to labor, human rights and also those specific ones relating to indigenous peoples, for instance, or also other groups. And so, yeah, and the SSF lex that I mentioned before. Now, to conclude, as Pradeep kindly mentioned, this book was published recently, and it's based on the thesis that I concluded on the international law for small-scale fisheries. Um, I, I, I am looking into ways to improve fisheries management, specifically the management and conservation of those transboundary aquatic species, which can be not only targeted by small-scale fisheries directly, it can be indirectly, but also the main point is that fisheries, the conservation management measures that are adopted by states at regional level, they can impact small-scale fisheries, and the importance, therefore, of them participating in some way. Of course, we all know the challenges of capacity and so on, but to not to forget that those decisions that are being adopted at the regional level with respect to and that are based on the cooperation by states to manage and conserve transboundary aquatic species, they have an impact on small-scale fisheries. And we all know about also the connectivity that is that really links one species to another, and the even though management and conservation measures are adopted to species that occur perhaps in distant waters, there are connectivity within across the ocean, so they can also impact small-scale fisheries in that sense. And so this book really explores the regulatory framework, the international law, not only the treaties, the legally binding instruments, but also the non-binding instruments, the principles and approaches, and therefore the need to link the ecosystem approach and the human rights to look into participatory fisheries management from the perspective of the fishers as well. So the importance not only as for having participatory fisheries management for the benefit of the resource, but also to secure the rights of small-scale fishers because they are dependent on those resources for their livelihoods. And in international legal scholarship, as also Pradeep mentioned, there has not been much. There's very little written about small-scale fisheries or relevant to small-scale fisheries, and this is because of a preliminary premise, let's say that international law would have very little or no pertinence to an influence on small-scale fisheries and vice versa, considering that small-scale fisheries, they occur in areas over which states exercise sovereignty and primary jurisdiction. But then what the book aims to provide is really more clarity on the relevance of international law to small-scale fisheries, and of course highlighting the significant contributions coming since the adoption of the small-scale fisheries guidelines. So and this again speaks not only to the ecosystem approach to fisheries, the human rights-based approach, but and also the benefits of participation to the realization of fundamental rights to adequate food and culture. And in this regard, there are jurisprudence at the international and regional level that recognizes fishing as part of the right to adequate food and to culture. And the linkages, therefore, are important also to sort of and has in effect led to decisions that protect those in this case in the indigenous communities that were being the fishing rights were being impacted by certain operations. In this book, I also explore the potential characterization of small-scale fisheries in international law. We all know that, and this is also enshrined in the small-scale fisheries guidelines, paragraph 2.4, if I'm not mistaken, that there is no definition of small-scale fisheries at the international level. And we know that it's because small-scale fisheries are so diverse, dynamic, and each country will have its own definition. What is considered small-scale in one country can be large-scale in another, and so on. But there has been some attempts to, and in effect, the EU and ICATS have adopted some criteria to define small-scale fisheries, or at least characterize small-scale fisheries. So there could be, I also discussed that in potential criteria for characterizing small-scale fisheries in international law. And also the practices of regional fishery bodies, which have to some extent signaled some intention to promote small-scale fisheries participation in their forums. So some examples are the CCAF, GFCM, the FFA, Pacific Island Foreign Fisheries Agency, the Secretary of Pacific Community, and the Caribbean Regional Fisheries Mechanism. And to conclude, really, I think the importance of this small-scale fisheries guidelines in transforming the fisheries governance at the global level is really to expand the interpretation of treaties when it comes to, for instance, taking into account the interests of small-scale fishers when adopting conservation management measures of straddling fish stocks and highly migratory fish stocks. What does that mean? So I think the small-scale fishery guidelines really complement those treaties and should always be read in conjunction to existing treaties to give meaning to those obligations and specifically call for their implementation in the small-scale fisheries context. Okay, so with this, I conclude my presentation. Here's my email if you would like to get in touch and ask questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Julia. That was wonderful, giving a broad overview of the importance of, international law, how small-scale fisheries, can be, governed, managed, but also understood. You talked about the definitional part of it, at the end in reference to your book. So that is all wonderful. So we now open it up for any possible questions. We are still waiting for questions to flow from the YouTube, but in the meantime, if I can start by congratulating you not only on your book, but the wonderful work that you are doing as part of FAO United Nations, especially focusing on the small-scale fisheries guidelines in and its implementation. Because it's one thing to create a guideline of that nature and at that scale, but most of the things around that depends on how it is implemented and taken to the real context itself, and that's the crux of the work as we understand, and so congratulations on all of that, including the book, that is so wonderfully done, and fills a real gap, as I started by saying in my introductions, So I want to kind of, mention one critical point, so there has been a lot of discussion around the binding, non-binding nature of the small-scale fisheries guidelines, and it is everybody's knowledge, that this is a legally non-binding, guideline, but you really meaningfully explain that, So if I correctly understood, so you're saying. Even if it's legally non-binding, the explicit reference to legally binding instruments, numerous instruments, makes it in a way normatively binding on the parties, on the states, because it draws reference to other instruments that are legally binding, so in the human rights and other labor and many other instruments, and that's a wonderful way to put it, so. And then explains, that even if it is a legally non-binding instrument, there are many elements, and the relationships it has with other instruments makes it actually normatively binding. Can you explain that a little bit more so that we understand it better?
Mhm. Yeah, thanks, Pradeep. This is actually you have to be very careful with the words
Yeah,
because
yeah,
yeah, it's not that the voluntary guidelines become normative, legally binding. It's and this is why I mean I refer to normative significance. It's a way of a nuanced way to say that even though it's voluntary, it does in one, international lawyers, they look into the language a lot. I mean, you can see all the language there is recommendations, is recognizing things. So there's no obligation per se. But what I meant by normative significance is that states have already adopted many treaties, and we know it's like it's so many treaties in different regimes, right? Human rights, the law of the sea, fisheries, environment, and those treaties, they would not explicitly refer to small-scale fisheries because it wouldn't be pertinent to refer to small-scale fisheries because, in the case of the Law of the Sea Convention, at that time it was negotiated. Perhaps this was not an issue that came to the attention by the states. And then reference was made more generally to fishing communities, and there you find a connection with small-scale fisheries more explicitly. But what I meant is that because those treaties are kind of, have a general language, they are applicable to all, everyone. I mean, especially human rights, right? It's a universal application. And what the SSF guidelines does is linking those obligations to small scale fisheries context. So really reminding or reiterating that states have committed to those treaties and they have to protect human rights also in small scale fisheries, and they have to protect decent work and ensure, elimination of discrimination against women in small scale fisheries as well. And I think that and it goes, of course, further in providing specific recommendations for states and non-state actors in how they can do that, right?
yeah,
So yeah.
yeah. And it builds a kind of a normative, obligation for states to seriously look at it, and they may be already doing many things within the ambit of those instruments, and there is now a need to link it with the SSF work, so it's make it rather more, quote unquote, easier for them to, establish that link as a normative, content, so that's really good. So we have a question with regard to the contributions of international law to SSF, and the question is, how this entire discussion around, contributions of international law is related to other formal informal laws that exist, at various other levels, so in the broader scheme of things, how international law then links with other informal formal laws in disparate geographies and scales of action within small scale fisheries.
Yeah, the primary instrument in international law for small-scale fisheries is the voluntary guidelines, even though it's a non-binding part of what is considered the international legal framework. And the connection, I mean, how states are going to implement that and how this is trickled down to the national, local level, of course, will depend on each state. And that gives, this is also an interesting point of being voluntary because, of course, we also know that each state has its own interests, needs, priorities, and so on. So they will be able to look into what are the recommendations that are part of their priorities and be able to implement those through national legislation. Now, we know the challenges of that, and this is why, all the efforts we've been trying to do at from the legal perspective is to try to investigate, okay, how states are implementing those recommendations in the guidelines, which speak to the very broad, holistic international law framework on different regimes, how they are doing that. And the database that I mentioned, the SSF Lex, in that we are trying to capture how the framework addresses those recommendations. There is, of course, already legislation that is already reflecting recommendations of the guidelines. And this is what we are trying to see the alignments where, because when there is gaps, of course, and I think this is the purpose of this exercise is to try to help states to enhance the framework and be able to then, address issues that are not being addressed at the national level. So
yeah. A related question is about institutions, policy, and legal frameworks, as you mentioned at the beginning of your talk
mhm,
itself. The question is, how do those, key elements connect with international governance? So uh,
mhm.
in itself, as I believe the question is about, how institutions, policy, and legal frameworks not only contribute but also become critical part of a governance framework for small scale fisheries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, this is how governance is on. I have explained as understood as having these three main components, let's say, that are essential for governance, and then you need. But when we are talking about small scale fisheries institutions, you have those more informal ones. You have, I mean, what, of course, this is, I spoke about from the perspective of FAO, but when you look into small scale fisheries, institutions can take form of community-based organization, or even communities, right? So this is perhaps not, yeah, maybe not applicable to small scale fisheries per se institution, the word institutions, but I think it's in the sense of the people, the
Yeah,
people that it's yeah, involved in, and then the policy and the legal framework. It's kind of guiding the governance in a way. I mean, and the policy, when I mention policy, also is a kind of a very broad term because there's reference to technical instruments, for instance, which are also kind of guiding how governance should be,
mhm,
and principles, approaches and all that. So
yeah,
it's a,
yeah, yeah.
mm,
And the policy is quite evident in one of the slides you showed, the numerous states that are coming up with some sort of policies around small scale fisheries. And that's very encouraging, of course, to see, and which also speaks that a transition to a more formal law, or if I may say that, on small scale fisheries at the state level definitely has to pass through policies which are more, these are policies are not laws. Policies provide the flexibility to experiment, to learn, and do things and
but
revise.
but, but it's a very important instrument because it inform in many cases where there is no, for instance, in some countries you don't have or the fisheries legislation is very outdated.
Yeah.
So how are you going to, it all starts with the
Yes.
policy and really setting priorities, what are the challenges and the issues, and then that will guide what the law, the content, what the law should address and all that. Yeah.
Exactly. And it gives the time to articulate the law in a proper way because the policy phase allows you that flexibility and time. So it's if we look at, how do you approach governance in small scale fisheries, so probably policy becomes a critical uh, phase before you get to, more hard and well-defined laws. So your reference to institution policy and legal frameworks, shows the process orientation around, building international law, around small scale fisheries. So yeah, I mean, I don't see any other questions, but if I may just ask one
Hmm.
last question in itself. So given the trajectory of small scale fisheries guidelines and the impact that it has created in numerous places around the world, what does the next couple of years look like from an implementation point of view, but also from what is next? Where, because as we implement a key instrument like the small scale fisheries guidelines, the surrounding drivers are also changing, like blue economy is coming in, and then
Hmm.
food debates around food security and aquaculture and other things are coming in. So there are drivers are increasing, both positive and otherwise. um, So what does it look like in the next, say, couple of years or a decade, in terms of where we can take small-scale fisheries guidelines in the real world? And this
Hmm.
is very important because the work we
Yeah, yeah,
do as part of this network, but
of
also
course.
other networks
Yeah,
need to address that question.
that's true. Yeah. I think I would emphasize again on the human rights based approach, because that's I think perhaps in the fisheries world, when you talk about human rights based approach, perhaps people tend to maybe have a defensive kind of a reaction, or in some cases, and when you're talking with different stakeholders. And I think one way to look at it is really by empowerment, in empowering the fishers, and looking at that we cannot solve the issue alone. And
Yeah,
and the fact that we draw attention to the human rights-based approach is really to empower the fishers, and to um, keep and make them more active, and participating, and having this bottom-up approach where you don't rely only, duty bearers. They have those obligations, they have these recommendations, but they as small scale fishers, they have the power, and the right to also engage, and take initiative and participate that, and make the action stronger. I think so. I think I would hope that this can really boost the power of small scale fishers to participate more on the processes. And I think in your network, and I think TBTI, I think that's the
yeah,
what I think the small scale fishers communities promotes. And I see, because if we only rely on certain actors and governments, it's going to be continues going to be a challenge, and taking a long time. And again, always looking at those duty bearers will not be. I mean, looking at the right holders, their powers, and the way that they can really make a difference in the collective action.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and emphasize. I like the way you kind of put the emphasis on more ground level actions and ground level mobilization and capacity development and those kind of things, because you know from an external perspective, it might be easier to create a policy if there is enough momentum and there is enough support. uh, the policy can be created, a law can be created, but the reflection of that policy and law on the ground depends on what you just articulated. The empowerment process, the entitlement process, and that comes from the human rights and justice and equity kind of considerations, but also how the people that live small scale fisheries in their daily lives would like to take it forward, given the challenges, given the odds of being within that sector itself. So a lot depends on those multiple things that you have just mentioned, and I think that's a good note to bring this to an end. But these discussions do continue, as we all know. So thank you very much, Julia. And this is a real contribution to the way we are trying to articulate and take forward, not only conceptually but methodologically, but also in terms of actions on how is it possible to navigate the many challenges of vulnerability and viability within small scale fisheries, but also trying to understand it, not just going from a vulnerable state to a viable state, and you have international law that makes them viable. So it very viable communities in small scale fisheries can become vulnerable if not enough consideration is given, not enough action is taking place. So it's both ways. And how to protect viable communities is also a question. It's not about responding to the vulnerabilities within the sector. And I think there is a real potential within the small scale fisheries guidelines to address those two things, not only addressing vulnerabilities and thinking in terms of sustainable fisheries, but also how do you protect for future the very sustainable and the viable small scale fisheries, so that they don't revert back to vulnerabilities. And that's a real potential within small scale fisheries guidelines as well. So thank you once again. And thanks to the
Thank you.
audience, that joined from different parts of the world. And of course, this recordings are going to be on the YouTube, so the debate continues, and that's a healthy process, I think. So we'll be in touch, and thank you very much once again. And I invite everybody
Thank
to
you.
the next month's thematic webinar series, which will be on the last Friday again, and the information will be available on our website. So thanks very much. Goodbye.
Thank you so much.